Well, you know, when I started this project, the project was started actually as a very small personal film that I didn't really think was going to reach a huge audience. I mean, I had sort of hoped that eventually it might get on PBS, since I had been working in public broadcasting for a number of years. But it was really initially seen as a very small film, and so once it got into Sundance, the response was pretty incredible and overwhelming, and it's been overwhelming actually ever since. And so I haven't quite caught up with myself since then. It seems like it's been playing at a lot of festivals and gotten has been very well received, more received than I ever imagined. Well, you know, when I was making the film, a lot of people would ask me, well, who is your audience? Who are you trying to reach with the film? And I never told my funders this really, but really I was making the film for my two mothers, my Korean birth mother and my American mom. And I felt like if I could somehow reach the two of them, that I would have succeeded. And so in some ways I think the film is the kind of piece that they can both watch, and it's very accessible to both of them. And I think it succeeds in saying what I wanted to say to both of them. So I'm happy about that. I think now that it's been seen by a lot of people at festivals and that it's going to be broadcast, what I'm most happy about is that the film seems to provoke a lot of conversations, very intense conversations among people about a lot of different things, you know, questions of identity and assimilation, and how our country has dealt with the whole issue of people of color and immigrants, and of course the whole adoption component. I think those conversations are really, really wonderful, and I hope that they continue on for a long time. I think the film also tends to evoke a lot of personal contemplation and an assessment of relationships and family, and that's also really great. So I'm glad that it's having that kind of impact. My relationship with my adoptive parents is good. You know, I see them fairly regularly and talk with them on the phone regularly. I think that, interestingly, the making of the film was it was a difficult emotional process for them initially, but I think that they actually grew a lot from it, and the conversations that we had and going to Korea together really brought us together. There's much more openness about talking about Korea, about my birth family. My birth family is much more included in our conversations as part of kind of our extended family, which was never like that before. So that's nice. With my Korean family, you know, it's more difficult because I haven't seen them, and let's see, I saw them last fall, and I'm hoping to see them this coming year. But I do communicate with them on the phone and through letters, and in some ways I feel like it's kind of a new beginning with my Korean family, that the making of the film and the things that we sort of resolved through that process, for me anyway, personally, has brought me to a different place with regard to my relationship with them. And it's exciting that way, because I feel like for the first time I'm in a position where I can start really getting to know them without having fears and, you know, sort of being driven by fears and fantasies and things like that, which was the case in the past. So I knew that the trip would would create some kind of change, but it was hard to predict I couldn't predict exactly what was going to happen. I think that for a lot of adoptees, and maybe this is the case for birth families as well, I know for me when I was growing up, I had a lot of fantasies about what my birth family was like, especially my birth mother. And I always imagined that once I found my mother, that there would be this instant bond, and that I would be so close to them, and that, you know, this was my blood family, and that I was going to have this is my real family, you know, those kinds of fantasies. And I think that all along, from the first time that I was reunited with them in 1983, up to this last trip with my American parents, that kind of thinking was still operating in my mind, that even though that you know, I hadn't seen them in a long time, that I was really close, and that, you know, that and also this fantasy about being Korean, that I was really Korean and not American, and these kinds of things. I think that this last trip with my family in the making of the film made me realize that, you know, this family, they are related to me, but they're strangers to me still in a significant way, and that there's incredible barriers, you know, not only of language but cultural barriers, and that if I continued to keep thinking of them in this sort of in this other realm, this sort of fantasy realm, that that in itself is a barrier to getting to know them as real people. So the exciting part for me is now getting to know them as just real people. People acknowledging that I don't know them well, that we are strangers to one another in significant ways, and that we can sort of start fresh, and that I can get to know them and that they can get to know me. You know, my feelings about international adoption, I think, have changed a lot over time. In my 20s, I was mostly angry about being adopted, and that angry toward my family here, at the world. I think that at that time I felt like, well, yeah, I was mostly just kind of confused and motivated a lot by feelings of anger. I think now it's sort of come around. Part of my feelings about adoption, international adoption in particular, has been really informed a lot by trying to understand my own mother's decision and why she gave me up, and also trying to see her in kind of the socio-political context of the times, and also seeing my American adoptive parents in sort of their context at the time. It's helped me to see kind of the whole picture versus just, you know, a mother giving up her child. For me, in the ideal world, I guess children would be raised by their own parents, and short of that, raised by a loving family within their own country. I think in the case of Korea, I guess what I would have liked to have seen is, I would have liked to have seen things just, you know, happen differently. You know, a lot of people would, when I started making this project, would say, including actually my family, my adoptive family, they would say, well, it was your fate to come to this country. It was your fate to be an American. It was your fate to be a part of our family.
Which would seem at the time incredibly disheartening.
Right. Well, I guess, you know, I don't know. I don't know what it is to believe in fate, but you know, part of me for a while believed, yeah, that was true, that this was my fate, and I just need to accept it. But I think that what I came to realize is that if I accept that position, it means that people have no control. And in a way, my being adopted here was a result of a series of decisions that individual people had made. and that also that governments had made, and that those decisions can be changed and different, and that affects how people's lives turn out. So, you know, in the case of Korea, adoptions from Korea, I really believe that, you know, if, for example, the cultural and social conditions were different, and if the relationship between the U.S. and Korea were different, that this adoption would not have taken place, and these adoptions from Korea would not have taken place on such a widespread scale. For example, for my mother, you know, she was a widow with 5 children, and there wasn't a lot of support for single-parent families, single mothers. There isn't a lot of support for widows. In fact, there's a considerable amount of stigma toward widows, single mothers, orphans, people who grow up in orphanages. And there was no free education beyond, I think, 3rd or 4th grade. In a country that values education incredibly. This was, you know, education was like one of my mother's key things that she wanted for her kids. You know, employment opportunities, some kind of safety net for the family to keep the family together. Instead, it was too easy for the family to break apart. And for my mother, it was too easy of an option, I think, for her to send some of her kids to an institution and have the institution raise her children rather than her raise the children. So there wasn't, I feel like, at least in the time that I grew up in Korea, that there wasn't really enough effort made to keep families together and to support single-parent families. And instead, international adoption had become such, it had become basically the Korean government's social policy toward orphans, toward abandoned children, in some case toward, you know, poor children. And so that became kind of the next step. So I guess my viewpoint about international adoption is, I think it's, you know, it's not, in some ways it defeats the purpose to say, well, is it good or bad? I mean, is international adoption good or is it bad? Should people be doing it or not? I think it's not necessarily a question of good or bad. It's just much more complex. There's a lot of different things to consider in that dynamic. You know, should wealthy Western countries be going to third world countries to sort of buy their children? You know, I think these kinds of questions, as difficult it is to talk about, needs to be addressed. Transracial adoption is also, I think, something that I'm sort of in transition with, in thinking about. I mean, certainly I'm opposed to taking children out of their families and putting them into, well, as in the case with Native American children, where they were taken out of their birth families and put into non-Native American families, predominantly white families, to be raised. I think that that was a misguided effort. In the case of African American children being adopted by white parents, I'm kind of in transition in thinking about that. You know, again, I think it's better for children to be raised by people, their birth families when possible, or people who are within their same cultural and racial background. And I think that you know, there's some, to me, there's some legitimate concerns about transracial adoption having to do, I mean, I myself have been transracially adopted, although it's interesting because Asian American, you know, when you think about Korean and a lot of Chinese children being adopted by white families, there's never been an organization like the Black Social Workers of America who came out opposed to transracial adoption in the 70s. There's never been a similar organized effort in the U.S. that has expressed any concern about Asian children being raised by white parents. And yet there are similar issues of cultural identity, assimilation, whether kids will grow up whether kids will grow up confused about who they are, whether they'll be equipped to be able to deal with racism and discrimination in society. From my personal experience, I guess I'd have to say that it was difficult growing up, in a white family with no Asian influence or role models. I mean, aside from, a handful of friends at school, there were really no Asians, or, I didn't grow up with any Asian anything. And I think it's hard to grow up in that kind of setting, especially when you go through teen years and you're really sorting out who you are, and early adult years too. Your sense of body image, your sense of aesthetic, about how you view yourself and your sort of your body. I don't know how else to say it. And how you belong in the world, and how you are in the world in terms of a lot of things. How you walk, I don't know. All those things are an important part of, I think, what you become, and it's difficult to sort that out when you're not in a situation that you have some kind of reinforcement, I guess, or not reinforcement, some kind of acceptance of who you are. Well, I know of adoptees who have adopted children, and it seems to have worked out really well. I think for me, it would be difficult for me personally to adopt, partly because I just feel like I've got my own issues with adoption, and it would be hard for me to thinking about, passing that on. And I mean, I already worry about it with my, my biological child, passing my neurosis on. I think also, I haven't really just sorted out all of my concerns about international adoption, and from sort of a moral, political perspective. So for me personally, it's probably not something that I would do. I think that being adopted has influenced my relationship in a way that has to do with trust. It's not so much about international or transracial adoption. I'll treat that separately, but I think being adopted in general, and having been having been abandoned or given up by my birth mother, I think has been the greatest contributor to how my relationships have developed in my lifetime. I think how I've approached, for me, I think in some ways relationships have been always transitory, and that I've had a difficult time looking at relationships with permanence. And it's taken me a really, really long time to feel comfortable with the idea that relationships can be long-term, and that you don't just go into them and then break them off, and go into them and break them off, and that kind of thing. So I think that that's been one of the greater influences in my life in terms of the way adoption has impacted me. In terms of the transracial nature of the adoption, how it's affected me, I think that growing up in a white family and in a white community, I mean, obviously my social life was within that family and within that community, and I identified for a long time with that world. I think the film is I mean, obviously it's about adoption and, you know, sort of undergoing emotional journeys. But I think in some ways, well, at its essence, I think the film is about loss and about reconciling loss and about having courage to reconcile the losses that we've had in our lives. You know, but I think there's also a lot in there about reconciling our relationships with our families and sort of coming to terms with our childhoods and coming to terms with our relationship with our parents. I think we all, as we grow up, in one way or another, have to come to terms with our history and our familial relationships. And for me, the process that my parents and I went through, my adoptive parents in particular, because they were much more involved in the filmmaking process, I think that the emotional journey that we went through was a difficult one, in that I was asking my parents to go to an emotional place that we hadn't really entered together before, and that you know, discussing things that we'd never talked about, and going to subjects that I knew created a lot of fear and anxiety, especially for my mother. And the fact that she eventually did go there, I think, gave me a sense that there was, you know, that she had a lot of courage, that both my parents had a lot of courage, and that both sides of my family actually expressed a lot of courage. And I guess if there was a message to the film, if it was reduced to that it would have to do with, you know, having courage to go to those difficult places. When I started thinking a lot about my Korean birth family, this was before I actually discovered that I actually had a family. I started dreaming. One of my early dreams actually was about my father, and I actually remembered a scene at his gravesite. In Korea, people are buried in big mounds, and then there's grass that grows over the mound, so they sort of become part of the earth in this kind of round mound. And one of my early dreams was, it must have been Chuseok, the Korean holiday in the fall, where you go and visit your ancestors' graves. And I was running around his grave, and then there was like a picnic and eating food. And that was sort of a pleasant, you know, interesting dream. And then I started having a series of very disturbing dreams about my father. You know, these images of him, these sort of images of his face, and kind of, you know, scary expressions, and this very disjointed dreams about him, and actually images of him lying on the floor dead. And so actually later on I found out that those weren't actually dreams, they were actual recollections of events. I confirmed different things through my brother, you know, of going there and having a Chuseok celebration at his grave. But initially, so a lot of my initial processing about being adopted started with my father, because in some ways his death, he died when I was, well, actually I thought he died when I was 5, but it turned out I was 5 Korean age, so Western age I would have been 3. And it was really his death that set off this whole series of decisions that brought me to America. And in some ways, losing him, I think, you know, also symbolized the beginning of the breakdown of our family, or the breaking apart of our family. So his death, and my father and his death, you know, have played a big role in not only thinking about adoption, but just a big role in general. You know, I think that, so anyway, so he played a big part in kind of my early reminiscences and remembrances of Korea. That particular moment when I saw his ghost was actually very scary. You know, I was returning from somewhere, driving in the car, and he literally swooped down into the seat next to me. And, you know, it's not like, it wasn't like, you know, the ghost that we sort of see in the movies. It was really, it was a sense of energy, a very definable energy in the car next to, you know, in the seat next to me. And, you know, I guess part of the explanation could be that it was a manifestation of my psychological state, that, you know, I was not only very depressed and confused, but that, you know, it could be sort of, you know, a kind of hallucination. I don't know, you know, I've never experienced anything like it since, but I have to say it was a very real, very live experience, and, you know, I was only really able to get through it with the help of a very close friend. I think that had I been alone experiencing that I would have probably ended my life that night. And that would have been it. I think also, you know, the Korean culture is a culture where it is possible to talk to the dead and to be visited by the dead. And, you know, I think the whole the shaman rituals is all about that to a large degree. And as you know, I lived there for 9 years. I think that as a kid I was quite influenced by that way of thinking. And to a degree, I'm still influenced by that way of thinking in a way, even though I've been raised, you know, and educated by Western society. There's a part of me that finds those kinds of things quite possible. So, you know, I think it's a part of, you know, people ask me often, well, do you really see yourself as a Korean, or do you see yourself as an American? And there's parts of me like that.
I scratched that question off my list.
Yeah, do you?
Just,
well, there's things like that I think are deeply ingrained in me, that are extremely Korean, that it's difficult to explain. How do you explain that to somebody?
so that begs the question, a more academic question, how much of oneself as an individual do you feel like is environmental, and how much is kind of genetic? You know, I mean, is that... But
I think it's difficult to divide yourself up, you know, this part of me is genetic and this part of me is environmental. I mean, I think there's both. You know, my adoptive parents have often commented on how different we are, you know, how different I am from them in lots of ways. And clearly there are genetic differences. But wow, there are a lot of similarities that, by virtue of having been brought up by them, that we share. And so, but you know, I refuse to really divide myself up into different components like that. You know, I think that my experiences of being raised for the first almost 9 years of my life has had a significant impact. I think that my birth family's influence on me in terms of what they've passed on genetically has had a lot of impact on how I've ended up. And I think I've had an incredible influence from living in this country and my American family. So it's hard to kind of separate myself out into percentages.